Governance 101. The 101 indicating that this is a review of the core aspects, the core perspectives that I have on governance. Now, governance is many things to many people. I alluded to that before we started the session. So I'm absolutely certain that not all of you will agree with not all I have to say. And that's okay. Because one of the core tenets of governance is adapting to change. Governance never ends. It is an ongoing, continual, and never-ending, infinite process. Yes. Infinite. And everything that entails. Who am I? My name is Brad Smith. I am a combat-trained consultant. I was in the United States Marine Corps. They taught me how all the creative ways that the Marine Corps prosecutes its mission, and I think everybody here knows what the Marine Corps' mission is. And then they promptly made me a computer programmer, and I've been trying to reconcile those two worlds ever since. It's amazing how compatible being a consultant and being a soldier are. But we can leave that for a debate in another time. I'm an entrepreneur. I have participated in multiple product ventures. Most failed, some succeeded. I participated in multiple services ventures. Most failed, some succeeded. There's a pattern there that is endemic for most entrepreneurs. So that if you haven't failed, then you haven't learned, at least from my perspective. Where we are on the business journey, I don't actually have the updated slide, Andrew, for the business journey, the updated slide deck for that. But we are right here. We are right there. Notice how there isn't any one arrow coming from this one to any other one. Because from this point forward, once we have governance in place, it applies to everything. Everything. Everything in the system, everything in the process, everything in this organization needs to be governed from this point forward. And so it's a very broad scope of what we're talking about. So what we're going to talk about is what governance is. We're going to talk about why you need it, because not everybody has it, right? Even though it's absolutely essential, and you cannot move forward in any kind of predictive or successful way without it, most people don't have it. Most organizations don't have it. And then we're going to talk about how to get it. And then we're going to open it up for QA. So what is governance? That is governance. Governance is a road, a path that you continually follow towards a destination that you never get to. Or more specifically, for any IT system, it's the end of life for that IT system. The governance plan, strategy for that IT system, that information system, continues until it's dead. But governance for your organization continues, hopefully, right, unless your organization is also dead. Because the governance will then you have to have a strategy of governance for other IT systems. So it is staying on the road, staying in the safe zone, moving forward and not running off a cliff or driving into an embankment or running head-on into somebody else that's approaching. It's the process of control. It is a mechanism, a strategy for control. This is why it's not positive, right? Is control a positive thing? Do people wake up in the morning and say, I really want to be controlled today? No. It's not a positive thing, but it's absolutely necessary. You need to know what's happening. You need to be able to affect how that system operates. You need to know what needs to change. You need to know what needs to change inside the system, and you need to know how to change it. That is the expression of control for an information system. When do you need to change it? How you need to change it in order to stay within your governance strategy, stay on the road, stay within the lines, and you need to know what you're changing. Why? to enable optimal system operation, staying on the road. Optimal system operation. You want to keep the system running in an optimal fashion, and I'm going to break down exactly what optimal means. On the road, not off a cliff. What is governance not? Governance is not a document, living or otherwise. How many have heard of the living document? It's like, oh, governance is okay, we'll just make sure that our document is alive. It is not a document. It is not a technology. It is not a person or a group of people. But all of these are part of a governance strategy. You cannot buy governance. There is no governance product that you can go and purchase from somebody. There are things that assist in operating, creating, identifying, managing a strategy, but all of them are just pieces of the overarching strategy. Okay, so this is when I start getting into things where there's some back and forth and some dialogue about what it means to be optimal system operation. I can throw up images of roads all day long, right? And say, stay on the road. And it's easy for us in context to stay on a road when you're in a car because it's easy to identify the road. The concern, the problem with IT systems is, what's the road? Where are the lines? How do we know that we're on the road? Not even just completely separate from the mechanisms that you use to stay on the road. So, what is optimal system operation? It's when the marginal costs of the system are exceeded by the value it generates. Can somebody tell me what happens when your value exceeds your cost, that intersection point? Somebody? Huh? You make money. What is that? What is break even? What's that called? ROI. The mythical ROI. That most organizations all talk about in the board of directors meetings about how they need to achieve cost neutral status. They need to achieve a return on investment. They need to maintain their marginal costs in a positive fashion. So that's the measurement. Your system is governed when its value exceeds its cost. That means you're on the road. The sum result of optimal operation is measurable satisfaction. That's the second half of it. You can sit there in your meetings all day long and talk about how, oh yeah, we need to make sure that our value is greater than our cost. Well, how do you know that? How do you define that? How do you know what your value is? In fact, how do you know what your costs are? Are you incorporating the total cost of operation, just the money that's coming out of the accounts? Are you incorporating the cost of resources, the man hours involved? Are you incorporating the costs of the loss of knowledge when people transition out of your organization? And that's just cost. Start talking about value. Are you just talking about value? Value is easy to produce in a product, right? How much product are you selling? How much money are you making? Revenue generation, that's a very easy thing to generate into a value calculation. But how do you calculate the value of something that allows you to competitive advantage you didn't have before? Everybody heard my comment on disruptive technology, right? What happens when you disrupt your organization with a new process that they could not accomplish before? Well, if you didn't do it before, how do you know what the value of that is? How do you calculate that? That is a thorny issue. You need to be able to wrap your heads as an organization around that value calculation, understand how that's benefiting your organization in terms of reduction of man hours, reduction of cost, increased competitiveness with your other organizations, or, with government, increased compliance. Because compliance definitely has a value. It is a cost all the way up until you're not compliant. And then it costs you money, and there is a value in preventing that. Security is the same way, information assurance. How do you calculate the value of something that's only valuable as long as it doesn't happen? You have to use historical data and estimate that. But that is the issue. That is governance. That is the strategy that you use to ensure that you stay on the road. Are you within the lines? It's a cost-value calculation. Governance has a timeline. In general, there are two perspectives for governance. There is where we are now and how we can improve, where we're going to be. So where we are now is the current status. Those are the definitions. Those are things like, well, again, following the analogy of the road, speed and position, where we are on the road right now, and steering and acceleration, how we can adjust to stay on the road and identify that we're still there. So we have current system status and we have planned improvement. Current system status is defining what needs to improve. How is the system currently performing? How do we determine performance? We have to establish thresholds, metrics, value calculations for us to define that this is what we should be doing and then be able to judge performance relative to that. Increased value is that when you're performing better than your metrics. Decreased value is when you're performing worse than them. So that's what's the first perspective of governance in order to understand where we are right now. Because the first decision needs to be identifying what should be improved, what needs to change. The second is planned improvement, how we need to. How do we need to improve? You set limits of change. Is it a good idea to identify that things need to improve and then just let people go without any guidance as to the nature of that improvement or how far you go with it? Absolutely not. That's called Wild Wild West. That's what many, many organizations do. They don't understand the direction of improvement. They just know that they need to improve. And so that they cycle off. And eventually they spend so much money in that without doing a cost-value analysis of whether or not they're still on that road, that it doesn't matter how improved that particular service, that particular system, that particular component of that technology is, it's already cost more than it will ever generate in value during the life of the system. So even if you can do an improvement, doesn't mean you should. Everybody's heard that, right? Just because you can change doesn't mean you should necessarily. That's an argument that's falling on deaf ears with certain political administrations right now. But it's true. Just because you can change doesn't mean it's valuable for you to. And governance helps you decide, is it valuable to change or not? So, if we implement an effective governance strategy for this particular organization, for this particular information system, there are 5 outcomes that you achieve that are good. Basically, you're setting goals for your governance strategy. This is why the strategy exists. It'll provide information governance, the ability to know what information you have, the formats, the locations, the access to it, the security context of it, the metadata, and the technical flu-flu that is named differently depending upon what technology you're actually identifying. But it's you know what your information is, you know where it is, you know how it's stored, and you know how to find it as a result. Project governance. Every organization has projects. You might call them something different. Programs, tasks, whatever. It's a particular action that must be taken, started, executed, and delivered. If you have an appropriate governance strategy, then that governance strategy incorporates that task-oriented delivery. IT assurance. Never has there been a bigger black hole than IT assurance. That incorporates a lot of different things. That's, do only the people that should have access have access? Have we achieved compliance with regulatory measures? Do we have a secure system? Is our information secure? Are our users' information secure? PII. Anybody know what I talk about, PII? Raise your hand if you have a PII problem. No? Personally identifiable information? It's big government right now. The U.S. government, anyway. Personal information for individuals in an organization. How do you identify that information like a social security number for us, or a home address, or a personal cell phone? How do you know that that isn't publicly available to people that shouldn't have access to it? That is both an information governance problem, identifying the information, and an IT assurance problem, ensuring that the process exists to identify it and remove it. So IT assurance is another outcome of properly implemented governance. Business technology alignment. This goes back to what Sharon was talking about earlier in the previous session. That's when you're actually seeing a mapping between the requirements and the technical scope. And she was only talking about a very small portion of that process. It starts earlier with business pains, even prior to the requirements definition. Goes from pains to requirements, from requirements to technical scopes, multiple technical scopes inheriting from one another. And then at the end, the decision-making process of, well, the technical scopes are there, we know that the requirements are there, but do we really need to address those business pains? It depends on the cost-value calculation. Is the cost of addressing that particular scope going to exceed the value gained from implementing it? That's how organizations determine that decision. The question is, for most organizations, whether or not they're deciding that with proper information. Because until they have a properly implemented governance strategy, they can't. They're guessing. And then continuous improvement. If you implement a governance strategy, not a document, not a software product, but a strategy of governance, then what you gain from it is a method of ensuring continuous improvement. You can identify what needs to change, you can identify how that improvement scope is established, and you can identify the process by which it should change, so you stay on the road. And if you have those things, then you have the opportunity to execute the holy grail of continuous improvement and adaptability, which allows you to maintain competitiveness, it allows you to maintain compliance and respond to threats as they arise, respond to changes or opportunities as they arise, and to do so in a way that isn't going to end up driving you off a cliff that you cannot recover from. Achieving these leads to measurable satisfaction. There's that measurable again. Measurable satisfaction. All right, so at this point, if a governance strategy is allowing us to achieve these 5 core principles, how do we measure satisfaction? How do we ensure that we stay on the road to get to that point? I like Dilbert. So does Sharon. I am a particular fan of this one because it's a multifaceted joke. I love quantum, theoretical physicists would find this, amusing. But it's very hard. Just conceptualize for a moment. It's very hard to know simultaneously where something is going and what its current state is, the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, right? It's very hard to do that even in a non-quantum fashion. Because the fact is that you're either focused on getting status or you're focused on determining direction. The minute you shift, something else is changing, right? Everything is always in motion. Whether your governance strategy was published as a document and it is the governance strategy for your organization, things continue to change without asking that document for permission. The minute you freeze a picture like that, it's already out of date. The minute that you determine it, it's already incorrect. And the duration of period before it's updated again is the determination of how far off the track you've come. How do you measure satisfaction? The crux of the matter, right? We want to stay on the road. The first step is to figure out, are we on the road? Where is the road? How wide is the road? Well, it's somewhat tricky. We've talked about that a little bit. But at its core, there are 2 ways to measure satisfaction for a business. There's organizational satisfaction, and that is a satisfaction that the company, the business, the unit achieves when it meets ROI. That is when your shareholders are like, yes, that's great. You are making more money or spending less money than the value that the unit is providing. It's great. An organization is happy. But there's another aspect of measurable satisfaction, another perspective that if you don't encompass it, will end up driving you off the other side of the road. And that's user satisfaction. How does a user measure satisfaction? Does the guy that's working in the office down the hall, does he care whether or not the business itself is making money other than the general, if it's not making money, then he loses his job? I mean, that's obviously important. But what's his definition of measurable progress, measurable governance of the system? Those are defined by service levels, SLAs. Now, everybody here has service levels identified for their IT systems, right? Everybody? Who doesn't? Who doesn't have a clearly defined and documented service level for the different aspects of their information systems? Obviously, just out of the box. So a user sees their satisfaction when their service levels at a minimum are met or exceeded. So that's when you've generated value for your users. Value for your organization is the most important, because even if your users are happy, if they're out of work, they're not happy. But if you don't identify the user satisfaction, that feeds into a nightmare interconnected web of additional possible outcomes, like losing all of your staff or losing key staff as they're not happy with the service levels they're providing. Just because the company's profitable doesn't mean it's not doing it on the backs of its people. And that is an unsustainable, ungoverned state. So, an example of ROI. I apologize for the ugliness of the chart. I didn't get enough time to incorporate the pretty pictures that I was being drawn for me. But the basic evaluation for ROI is threefold. You have a period where costs are increasing but value is decreasing. Can somebody tell me what period that would be? When the value of the system is going down but the costs are going up? Implementation. Right? When you're implementing the system, are very many people, especially with a disruptive one, are very many people happy with it? Are they using it the way that they should? Absolutely not. In fact, if you map out the successful execution of an adoption plan, you'll find that the value is very similar and maps very closely to the adoption of it. How do you generate value in an information system? When information and users are using it. So you'll find that there is a very close map between those two. So net ROI is achieved when the cost of the system is exceeded by the value being generated by it. Now, let me ask you this. The holy grail for IT systems, a provable, calculable achievement of ROI. Great. What happens then? Is everything golden after that? Do the costs of a system always stay the same? No. What if it goes through an upgrade? What if it goes through a migration? Microsoft hates it when I present this idea. The first question I ever ask to any of my customers that says, hey, we want to come in and talk about a SharePoint 2010 upgrade. My first question is, why do you need SharePoint 2010? Have you achieved ROI on SharePoint 2007? Show me your ROI, cost value analysis, so that you don't end up taking yourself right back down into a negative ROI state. Right? If you look at ROI as a continuum from the day that you start spending on that system to the day that you're currently at, there is a total number of dollars or pounds or chickens, in Rob Foster's case, it's currency he wants to use. There's a total number of units of currency that you have consumed in the implementation and running of that system. And if the value, even if it exceeded it at one point, the system's going to continue life after that. And at any point later, if the costs exceed the value, you can then end up in a negative net ROI. Now, most organizations don't get excited about it because most organizations are not excited about the end of life. But the reality is that the true final ROI of any system is only determined at the end of its life. When you look back and you say, this is how much this system cost us over the total lifespan of it. And this is how much value we generated from it. Most organizations don't have the wherewithal or really look at that as a possible value. They look at ROI as something to be maintained over time, which is good. That's what they should be doing because it constantly changes. But just because you reach a net neutral cost point does not mean that you cannot go negative after that. It requires constant vigilance to ensure that that does not happen. It requires continued governance.
Would you ever consider opportunity costs in that calculation?
You should. And those opportunity costs can vary widely. Consider if you're talking about a competitive venture and you're in a CRM system, if your CRM system is not being improved upon in a certain amount, then the cost calculation ends up incorporating lost business that you otherwise could have won, but you weren't tracking your pipeline well enough. You need to look at it from all aspects. As many aspects as you can afford to. Because I'll get to it in the end. I'm talking about these perfect ideals of being able to know all this information. But trust me, I understand that you're not going to know most of it. SLA examples for Fizz Energy, talking about the headquarters element of an energy company. Two that come to mind, legal and environmental compliance. Those are service levels that, if not met, will directly impact the survival of the business, as indicated by Zenith, let alone user satisfaction. But if those users in the legal department, especially in legal, right? These are very risk averse, are they not? You know why? Because they're liable for the changes that they advise or sign. So when your entire career is on the line or possible jail time is the result of non-compliance, then suddenly it becomes rather critical to ensure that that service level is met. Environmental compliance. That's a serious problem in this current day and age. And they're very similar in some of their requirements, such as online retention, significant online retention periods. But for environmental compliance, we're talking about 20 years, and they're talking about expanding that, right? Because with an environmental perspective, they want to measure impact over multiple decades. And they're going to hold them accountable whether they have that information tracked or not. So being able to predictively respond to it and prepare for it means that they have to have it. That's a service level that must be maintained. It is part of a governance strategy that may or may not exist. Why do you need governance? Why do you need governance first? Why are we talking about governance in the fourth session? We haven't implemented anything. We've just barely decided to use SharePoint. In Sharon's case, let's say that it's because they had the licenses. We're just decided to implement SharePoint. We haven't gotten any farther down. Do you think it's a good idea for us to determine whether or not we're on the road while we're driving on it? No. This is a process that needs to be done before rubber hits the road, I guess is a good way to say it. Before you start implementation. It has to be solved first. You have to start thinking about it before that happens. It will impact your design and implementation pretty significantly in some cases. Achieving ROI will impact how frequent you improve. Do you think it's a good, it's like we have 48 different things that we can improve in our organization after the implementation of SharePoint. Every single one is going to provide a net return and value over time. Is it a good idea to do them all at the same time? Is that going to generate a net ROI? Or is it going to generate a hole that's going to take you 7 years of value operation to get out of? Most IT systems don't last 3. So how are you going to achieve ROI if you do all of them at the same time? You can't. Maintaining ROI, or marginal cost management, will impact the frequency of how often you can improve the system, how often you can put some new application or new solution in place. It will throttle that. There's only so much capital, there's only so much money that you can possibly spend to maintain ROI and marginal costs. And it will help you determine if the improvement is worth the cost. Again, just because you can improve it doesn't mean it should be improved for your organization. Anything can be improved. Not everything is going to provide a positive value proposition. Service levels. They'll derive the farm configuration. Service levels for Fizz. We're talking about an organization that has small units distributed globally, larger units that are very insular and very high-level research and development shops distributed regionally, and a single office that's responsible for governmental and legal compliance, the likes of which most organizations never see. That's a very complex set of service levels that need to be defined, because if you don't define them, then you don't know whether or not you're compliant. Just to highlight the point, I did some work for the American Petroleum Institute a couple years back. They're a happy bunch of people right now, I can tell you. They estimated that most energy companies, most oil companies, spend as much as 40% of their total overhead on compliance and regulation alone. You think it's important to them to maintain a compliance measure in their governance strategy. That's a ridiculous amount of money. That's more than the US government spends on it. Of course, they're also penetrated a lot more often by hackers than gas and oil companies are. So, the impact of service level definition, they'll impact the taxonomy and ontological definition of content. They're going to impact the visual design of every site, every application, every solution. Is it easier to define those changes up front for service levels, or after you implement what you think is supposed to be done by technologists, CTOs that want to get the technology out, and then to have to come back and change them after the fact? Which one is going to generate more cost, therefore reduce the net value of the system? Governance first. So how do we get governance? You get the first part of governance with your definitions, your matrix. The matrix has two pieces, and they map to that timeline. There are the definitions of metrics and KPIs, policies, information architecture, adoption, all these things that go in to define what things are right now, the status of the system. And then there are plans. The plans define the process of change management as you move forward to ensure that as you improve these things, you define those scopes of change. You do them within your governance strategy so you don't drive off a cliff. The governance team is the second portion. Governance team. Board, council, committee, whatever you want to call it. How many people in their organizations have an effective and authoritative governance board? I see one hand. I see two hands. Anyone else? How many people think they need one? Everybody should be raising their hand, except for the two that already have it.
I've got a board, but is it effective? No.
Exactly. Most people have boards, not shareholders, not boards of directors, governance boards. Most people have boards. Very few of them effectively are able to manage or authoritatively run their governance strategy. This is what most people end up doing. Governance through luck. Oh, and it's very real. And you can still make money doing it. You can still provide value. Just because you're rolling the dice doesn't mean it doesn't come up with 7 or every once in a while. Or, as I used to say, even a blind squirrel gets a nut some days. So many CEOs are what I would call blind squirrels. They instinctually, they use their instinct, their gut reaction to change, and they respond with implementation of systems and say, well, people are moving in this direction, there's business here, we think we can do it, they do it. The CIOs that are lucky are the ones that keep their jobs. The CIOs that are unlucky are the ones that don't. It's a lot easier for an organization of a couple thousand people to fire a CIO than it is to fire a mid-level manager, believe it or not. C-level executives are a dime a dozen. There's 1,000 frickin' C-level executives out there with proven good luck that they can hire in to try that again. So how do you remove the luck? You do it through effective implementation of governance. The governance matrix provides your alignment, your strategic alignment, staying on the road, your definitions of business goals, directives, and policies, the structure for your business, your specifications, SLAs, and architecture, your metrics. Most of these, most organizations already have. but incorporating that into a holistic strategy vision, a definition of your whole governance status. And then the plans, the actual processes that you define to assess, implement, value, calculate the changes that you want to make. Do not confuse activity with progress. I learned that from a drill instructor. Just because you see things happening does not mean you're making progress. But the mirror image of that statement is, how do you determine that an activity is actually progress? You have to be able to measure it against two things: where you are and where you're going. Perfect world, right? A governance team, in order to actually maintain and drive a governance strategy for an organization, is simply a leadership team that is cross-siloed and multidisciplinary across all aspects of that information system, with the authority to make the changes and the accountability for doing so. Meaning that they have the authority to decide that strategy's execution, and they have the accountability, they're being held accountable if it doesn't happen. That is a governance team. You cannot have ownership of a strategy like a governance strategy that is that umbrella-wide, that is that totalitarian, without these. The governance team has to have them. There is no dissension. There's no middle ground. You cannot have ownership without both authority and accountability. How many people here at times in their careers have ever been held responsible for something they did not have the authority to change? Are you still at those jobs? That's where the frustration comes from. That's where it becomes impossible to do your job. Right? How are you supposed to do your job if you can identify problems and you're being held accountable for solving them, but you don't actually have the ability to change anything? Or how about people that are given total authority to do anything they want and then not held accountable when it doesn't work? How many people have seen that before? Yeah. How many CIOs, CTOs, C-level executives? I love it. I'm a C-level executive, so I can, dump on myself all day. But how many of them make those decisions in a vacuum? They come down and they think they're applying leadership. Pointy-haired bosses. Prepare for leadership insertion. That's exactly what they do. You have to have both. That governance team has to have both. And in true democratic fashion, it has to be a multiple-person team. The minute you have one person in that position, you end up with dictatorship. You have to have one person that's providing leadership and vision. It should always be the CIO. If the CIO, and this is another problematic thing, if the CIO is not capable or not effective in doing that, he needs to be fired. Now, I'm not saying that any of you are going to have the authority to go back and start firing your CIOs that you're reporting to, but the reality is, nonetheless, that. Provide the leadership for the team, but they are not the team themselves. It's fed and staffed by stakeholders from all the business divisions. In Fizz Energy's experience, it would be the CIO, the newly assigned CIO, and representatives from the business units for all three parts of Fizz. Business units, the people that are feeding requirements, that are being held accountable for delivery of their particular jobs, their particular processes, their particular products, services. They are the ones that need to be on the governance council. And the governance council then asks the technical people to come in and present to them so that they can update the strategy with a technical scope. Yeah?
On the governance council, would you not have somebody there from finance also? Surely there needs to be at that level.
Absolutely. But as I said, all business units that are responsible for that service, compliance or IA is a service. It's just provided, sourced internally. They provide that information assurance service. It shouldn't be the technical server managers or security folks, the Active Directory engineers, it should be the IA boss, the person in charge of information assurance for that organization. But you definitely need to have them on there. Every single member division of the organization needs to be represented. Every single one. Every single one, right? This governance strategy that we're talking about is going to encompass governance across the whole company. So how are you going to know that you're on the road if there is an entire portion of the business that is not represented in the decision-making process?
If you have that many folk in your governance board, how do you reach consensus?
Leadership and process. I mean, I'm not really constructing the structure for a governance board on here, but I've constructed many, and every single one is different. Every single one is different. They all have unique fingerprints from each organization. Implementing governance boards in the United States military organizations is a lot of fun because they think it maps to their rank structure, and it never does. So when you have generals taking orders from captains, people start getting irritable. But the simple fact is, and the response to your question, is that it varies widely, and the more people you have to have in that governance council to represent all these different portions, the more significant the process management becomes for reaching consensus in that council. But then again, if your organization is that large, there's no way to avoid it. You have to do it. You have to find a way of reaching consensus.
Very large, many business units and operational activity in there, but there is no single leader. So we have to reach consensus by vote, which I find very weak.
Right. You need to have a leader. I mean, see, I told you I didn't have anything positive to say. I'm not up here, I'm not going to be able to say, hey, here's the easy button, congratulations, you all have governance. Really easy, right? No, I don't have anything positive to say. You have to have the vision. You have to have that leader who's responsible for managing consensus on the board. He's not responsible for making the decisions. He's responsible for identifying the consensus for the decisions. And that's the CIO. Or what it should be. Yeah. I mean, and that's the reality of it. I don't have anything positive to say. That's just the way it's got to be. There are some things in life that you just can't change, and that is one of them. You just have to do it this way. And the more complex the system, the more critical it becomes to do it that way. Governance is really easy in a 10-person company. It's really easy. In a 10,000-person company, you better have this stuff straight. And it's not easy. In fact, this is the point where I typically tell my customers that they're not going to achieve this. Not 100%. Remember when I said this was an ongoing, iterative, and infinite process? Just like perfection. There's no such thing as perfection. You will never achieve total governance, ever. If you go into the process of defining governance and establishing it with that expectation, then you won't suffer for it. You will never be fully governed. It's what's the name of that guy that the Greek gods punished by always having to push the rock uphill, and he pushes it up and then it rolls right back down and he has to push it up again? Sisyphus. That's exactly what it is. It's depressing. It's depressing to even consider, but it's the reality and the truth of the situation. It will never end. It will always have to have effort. It will always have to have investment as long as you are actively trying to use information systems. Always. And you'll never get to the top. You'll always be close. Sometimes you'll be closer. Sometimes you'll be farther.
So this is the hard, the difficult sell when you're trying to set this up at the beginning of the project. And they just want all the shiny baubles and all the good stuff. I have a hard time getting them to
Yeah.
really do it.
When you have the PMO guy sitting there, it's like, well, the price point's too high right now, so we're going to just do the technical implementation. We'll cut QA and tech training and take care of it later.
Yeah, so,
Governance. What do we need governance for? We're already governed. Our CEO's in charge.
so how do you, what would you advise as ways to get people to go and really want to do it? That's the difficult thing.
Right.
For them to want to do it, not feeling forced or obligated. It's another boring thing that they have to do.
Right.
How do you sell governance?
How to sell governance. Tell them what happens without it.
And the government just say the opposite.
Well, believe it or not, in the U.S. government, everything's about governance now. Everything. They wouldn't, you try to go in there and present anything about governance a year and a half ago, and they would laugh you right out the door. Well, we're the government. Of course we're governed. Yeah, and then when Congress comes down and slices their budgets by 80%, suddenly they're willing to talk. Or when WikiLeaks gets their hands on half of our classified documentation from 1 month in Afghanistan. That was a governance problem. That should not have happened. It wasn't the fact that WikiLeaks existed. There are always people that are trying to get things out of your organizations, right? There's always competitors, given that you afforded the opportunity. How am I doing, Andrew? Am I running long? There's always somebody that wants your information, that wants what you have. There's always somebody out there that's contentious or opposing your position. Am I doing good? The reality is that if you govern your systems, you prevent them from having the opportunity to take advantage of that. It's not their fault, it's your fault. And trust me, your bosses will hold you compliant or hold you accountable for that.
So Brad, one of the ones I think you brought up before, how do you sell that governance concept? I think Bill was more stuff about management. There's no CIOs in this room, there's no people setting a vision. And we asked the question, how many people here have got a vision of where they're going as an organization? So if you start to challenge the organization, if you want to SharePoint, great. And then a year down the line, 2 years down the line, when we spend all this money, and then you want to demonstrate that, what am I going to do? What's going to take? Where are we trying to go? We can do lots of stuff. I can write lots of code, like I said, in the requirements. We can be really good at what we do. But actually, we're just, the bad news now is we've got lots of activities, but no progress. So if you start to ask them the question about defining, and I should have walked in front, defining your goal and your vision, right, so where are you trying to go from a governance perspective, from east to steers, something like that analogy, governance to steer. If I know where I'm going, then I can steer in that direction. You've got to tell me where we should go.
Right.
Now, Bill will go and manage up. Organizers might not know that, so we can help them in that process, but ultimately we need a vision.
The sale of governance too. Now, not many governance, how many people have had a governance presented to them either by a consultant or by some internal organization? Had governance presented to them. How many of those governance presentations include definitions for SLAs and ROI achievement, value cost analysis? So that's the second half. The tongue-in-cheek answers tell them the horror stories of what happens if they don't, but we don't want to do negative reinforcement, right? It's already negative enough. Try to do positive reinforcement. It's like raising a kid, you know? Tell them about how much money they'll save. We drive on the road, we make money, or we cut costs, reduce expenditures. Our total cost of ownership goes down. Our service level achievement goes up. Our profitability increases, not because we're necessarily making more revenue in the case of, like a governmental organization, but because our costs are lower. So we can spend that money on other things, such as improvement, in such a way that we can still functionally demonstrate mathematically that we're maintaining our value cost proposition. If you have those numbers, if you're defining those thresholds and those metrics, then you can start at the ROI calculation, go to the board. I'll tell you what, you will get a lot of people interested in what you're talking about if you walk in and tell them that you can save them a couple $1 million a year. And SharePoint is a fantastic platform to add on. Notice I haven't really talked about SharePoint much, have I? Do you think that it's important, that the governance is important only for SharePoint? No. This is cross-platform. This is multidisciplinary. This is heterogeneous. And it covers everything. And when you start tying systems into your SharePoint platform, this is no longer SharePoint. It's now become your information management system. That could include everything from Documentum, Lotus Notes. I can tell you right now, I was in the Marine Corps. I've done plenty of consulting for the Marine Corps. Every single piece of hardware or software for computing that has ever been devised by mankind is still running in the United States Marine Corps somewhere. I can prove it. I'd like to consider myself at least fairly young. And when I enlisted in the Marine Corps, the first thing they taught me is how to print punch cards. That was 40 years before I was born. Not that long. But my point is that you will always have a multi-platform environment. You will always be either migrating to or from things. Multi-platform means the different versions. There's a big difference between the platform of 2001 versus the platform of 2003 versus the platform of 2007 and then 2010 and then whatever comes next. Each one of them might as well be their own IT system. But in the cases of most things, you establish your strategy for the things you can maintain and you start widening it as you have the ability to adapt and incorporating other elements. That iterative improvement that we were talking about, that's not just iterating through your technical systems and improving those. That's iterating through your process and improving it with technology. Disrupting your business. So, what are the conclusions of what I've talked about today? I want you to know two things. If you walk out of this session with only two things, takeaways, going back to your organizations, these are the two things I want you to walk away with. Governance is hard. It is damn hard. In fact, it's probably one of the hardest things you will ever have to do inside information systems. And it is absolutely critical. And it will never end. Just remember Sisyphus. At least we get to sit at a desk while we're pushing that rock uphill. A good way to look at it, a more positive look at it, is that we're on a road, right? Driving off a cliff is not about the destination you get to. You never get there if you're off a cliff. It's about the journey. Staying on that road. Stay focused on the fact that you want to stay on that road. And then all the things that we're going to talk about over the next 3 days will be achievable because you haven't driven off a cliff and died in a fiery inferno. That's what we want to avoid. The second is that governance is measurable. Measurable. Nobody presents it that way, or at least not most people present it that way. Andrew, I'm sure you present it that way, right?
I don't present a bit of the because I'm a little bit more positive.
Yeah, how many people know of a failed SharePoint implementation? Yeah, at one point in the latter half of 2008, a report from the Radicati Group estimated that 73% of SharePoint implementations fail. Is that because SharePoint's a bad product? Is it the technology's fault? No. It doesn't matter what you pick. It doesn't matter what you pick. You could pick .NET Nuke, start with just plain ASP.NET. If you set up governance right, you can construct any system you want in any software technology anywhere in the world to do anything. Software is extremely mutable. All you need is people that know what they're doing and a very clear definition of what you're trying to do. It's never the technology. It's always the process. It's always the governance. So, that second idea, governance is measurable. It is something that is provable. And if you cannot prove it, then you're wrong. Something needs to change. Something is missing. Something needs to be done. It's not, oh, we're different. We're special. We're unique. We don't need to be able to prove governance. Good luck. Roll those dice. See if you come up with a 7 or an 11. Yes, ma'am. Right.
And then by the time you've reached the point where you're saying, look, it's 2 years down the line or whatever,
When your prototype proof of concept system is already in production and 30,000 people are using it, yeah.
and then they're saying, oh, well, yes, right, sounds really good on the next
Yep.
level.
I know.
That's why it's hard.
Well, that's one of the reasons. Why? Because nobody wants to do it. Nobody wants to be Sisyphus. Nobody wants to do it. Just because you have to doesn't make it palatable to do it, but you still have to.
I'm doing it, but not the CEOs, that's the
Right.
who are willing to do it. But very often it's that you're right,
Right.
what is the technical? Because there's so much emphasis on the technology for what the future could bring.
Right, and I'm not, I truly, I'm not trying to be a smartass when I say it. I'm not. And tact is obviously part of who I am. I'm a very peaceful and tactful kind of guy. I never say anything incendiary. But these are problems that you most likely will not be able to fix. You will be able to advise and go back and provide information as best you can and say, governance is measurable. If we can't do it, we're screwed. Eventually, it's going to come back and bite us in the ass. Unless you're lucky enough, and this happens. Good things happen to bad people. Unless you sell the company to a larger organization before they find out that they were running towards a cliff. It does happen sometimes. Sometimes you get lucky. But if they can't do that, then you have to consider one of two things. Either go back and convince them to do that, or resolve yourself to the fact that you'll keep an eye out for when that cliff starts approaching, and then go and get another job before it arrives. I mean, I'm not trying to be a smartass. There are problems that we can't fix, right? I'm a solutions guy. I can come up with the solutions. You can come up with the solutions. We know what we should do. We know what common sense tells us we should do and what other people should do, but you don't always get the luxury of changing it. Oftentimes, all you can do is go back and say, this is the way it should be, and become an evangelist for change.
You could do it in your own little piece.
Right, and you can do it in your own little piece. And there are plenty of instances where organizations, where they end up scoping it down to particular business divisions where they have more control than others. And of course, because we are the gods of fizz energy, we can define that entire virtual environment ourselves. We assume that we can have total control over all three. But one of those business divisions might end up being governed. In fact, that governance might end up providing enough value so that it ends up dragging, kicking, and screaming the others to value. It happens.
Maybe what you do, if you construct the project so they take on board that they go after ROI and then they have SLAs, and then later on you say, well, to measure and control this, we need governance. Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Something like that.
and limit the scope. But see, that's the thing. Remember, it's infinite and it never ends. So you start governance in one place, you demonstrate that value, you move it on. You move it on, you iterate through, and then you see it expand out from there across the organization. You keep on leading it. And then sometimes you encounter somebody else that's a real pain in the ass, and then you end up backing out or retreating for a while, and then you come in from a different angle. But you have to continue down that path. Your organization will suffer if it doesn't. So here's a couple of additional references that I wanted to mention, some things that are key to certain aspects of governance and what I've talked about. SLAs are far more complex than what I alluded to. I said SLAs are key, and they are. But SLAs are constructed from what's called OLAs, and OLAs are constructed by a process that you establish around information, system, and technology management. One of the really good hot button methodologies for establishing that is the ITIL process. So I would recommend that if you haven't looked at that, I'm sure that most of you already heard of that, right? You've heard of ITIL before? Most of the time, people think of it as a help desk process. It's not. It's an IT sustainment process. So if the assumption is that you're buying SharePoint and implementing something and then you actually want it to continue to operate, ITIL is something that you probably should look at. Or something similar. It is by no way the only one, but it's the one that I encounter most often, and it's pretty powerful. Governance. This is not a SharePoint site. IT governance. This is a discipline and a message that needs to happen across all information systems. So governance, additional resources for those. Research that. Take that research and drive it back into your organization. Do I have any questions?